de Souza, Didi Kosambi, visiting professor at Goa University, India, expert team on UNESCO report about re-imaging our future together. And he will present a topic about knowledge common and digital futures. And as respondent from FGB ITB is Professor Armin Langi from School of Electrical Engineering and Informatics, ITB. Before we start the lecture, there will be an opening remarks from the chairman of the FGB ITB, Professor Edi Tribaskoro. So please welcome Professor Edi Tribaskoro.
Okay, thank you, Professor Malia Singhi. Good morning, everyone, and also good evening, especially to Professor Peter Ronald de Souza in New York. It's a great honor to welcome all of you to the Forum Guru Besar ITB Distinguished Lecture Series. We are very grateful to welcome Director of ITB, Professor Reni Wirahadikusuma, and the Chairman of the Academic Senate of ITB, Professor Hermawan Krishno Dipoyono, also to all members of Forum Guru Besar ITB, and all distinguished guests, professors, lecturers, students from various universities and practitioners in Indonesia. Thank you for your participation to this program. Today's event is a very first season of our distinguished lecture series, which will be run throughout this year, 2022. The purpose of this distinguished lecture series is to discuss the latest issues regarding the development of science, technology, and humanities, and their impact on the values to cope with a better life in the era full of challenges and uncertainties. I am very honored and delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker for this event, Professor Peter Ronald de Souza from Goa University, India, and he's also an expert team on the UNESCO report, Reimagining Our Futures Together. Thank you, Professor de Souza, for your willingness to share with us about the current issues on knowledge commons. In this digital age, there are at least two views of knowledge: commons and enclosures. In today's global knowledge-based economy, academics are aware that the knowledge they do on a daily basis is valuable, but it also can be sold, bought, and traded. As a result, the issue of ownership of knowledge becomes a complex issue. From today's discussion, we'll be learning how the academia will take a part in this development and deal with all the challenges. I would like to express our gratitude to Professor Armin Langi for his willingness to be a respondent for this event. And special thanks to Professor Yasraf Piliang and Professor Iwan Pranoto as the head and the secretary of the FGB Commission on the ITB's ethical and academic values, respectively, for their effort and thought in bringing the current issue of knowledge commons in our today's event. This issue is very important and relevant to the roles of Forum Guru Besar of ITB. Ladies and gentlemen, until the end of this year, we plan to have 7 distinguished lectures with various topics. Among them are, first, a planet in peril and the effects on educational values. Second, the decline of democracy and social political polarization. Third, digital paradox, the connecting and the dividing, and fourth, social fragmentation and the changing educational values. We do hope that in today's lectures and discussion, we could enhance our understanding about the notion of knowledge commons that have been now actualized widely, and the ethical values as the consequences. I believe that the lecture and discussion will be fruitful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Edi Baskoro. Before we start the lecture, allow me to announce some information. First of all, is the committee request to take photograph of us before the lecture begin. So please all participants ready to open the video just for a while for the photographs. And then during the presentation, if you have any question, you can write down your question on the chat column. Yeah, there, down there. Or on the if you want to do directly asking the question to the presenter, so there will be a Q&A session later after the lecture, after the discussion with the Professor Armain, and you can raise hand using the raise hand icon down there too, so we can notice your question, and then we will have a discussion later. Okay, so before the lecture begin, I would like to read a brief profile of Professor Peter Ronald de Souza. Okay, I'm very sorry to Professor Peter de Souza that your profile will be a little bit shortened because it's it's too long. I mean, but it's a very, very nice profile. So let me share the screen. Yeah, hold on a minute. Okay, so this is a brief profile of Professor Peter Ronald de Souza. Okay, yep. Professor de Souza is the D.D. Kosambi Visiting Professor at Goa University, India. He was professor at the Center of Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, till February 2020. And Professor de Souza was director of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, SIMLA, for 2 terms from 2007 till 2013. And Professor de Souza is an expert team in the UNESCO report for Reimaging Our Future Together. And Professor de Souza works on issue of democratic politics and in the comparative politics of South Asia. This is very interesting. And Professor de Souza wrote several books, such as Keywords of India. So the book is there. It's very interesting cover. I believe the insight also good. The conceptual lexicon for 21st century in 2020. In the Hall of Mirrors into 2018. A companion to Indian Democracy, Resiliency, Fragility, Ambivalence, co-edited with Mr. Sanjir Alam. Yeah, it's forthcoming, but I believe they probably already been published in 2021. Yeah, and he is also editor of many books. Yeah, at Home of Democracy and many articles in various journals. And Professor de Souza writes occasional columns in India Express, The Hindu, and Scroll In. Okay, so this is the brief profile of Professor Peter de Souza. So your presentation, Professor Peter, will be 45 minutes. And during the lecture, the participant can also write the question on the chat column. But we will read after the question after the lecture finished. And After the lecture, Professor Armin Langi from ITB will respond to the topic and continue to Q&A session from the floor. So that's the a brief information for you. And now it's time is yours for Professor Peter Ronald de Souza. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Peter Ronald de Souza.
Good morning, and thank you very much for those kind words, Professor Madhulya Singh. Thank you to Professor Armin Langi, Professor Eddie Vascaro, and Professor Ivan Pronoto for this very, very generous invitation to speak at such a prestigious forum, at such a prestigious institute in such a historic city. I feel very honored to be invited to talk to you. The presentation that I make today must begin with a caveat. I'm not an expert on digital futures. I'm a political scientist who has strayed from my area of core competence. But I did that because as a member of the research group that was advising UNESCO on their flagship report, which the chair very kindly mentioned, I was asked to write a brief background note on the knowledge commons. And I began to research that. And I found some very interesting questions, which I thought must be made available to the larger academic community. Since then, so I wrote that note, it's published, it's available online. Since then, and further research on this, I just did a presentation for UNESCO on a similar topic. I have come to realize, and speaking at the Bandung Institute of Technology makes it even more important, I've come to realize that thinking and talking about the knowledge commons in a digital age brings us very much into what I call the politics of knowledge. Now, as a political scientist, this makes a lot of sense to me, the politics of knowledge. I would like my colleagues who are engineers, who are mathematicians, who are scientists, who are technologists, to keep this phrase in mind, because in Indonesia, in India, in many countries of the global south, the politics of knowledge is extremely important. And it is through that politics that we begin to construct our own conceptions of the world and the policies that flow from that. And I hope to show the politics of knowledge in my lecture as I go along. So that's the first caveat. Now, I've presented my lecture in two parts. Firstly, I've discussed the knowledge commons, right, in the digital age, specifically looking at the world that tech science and technology is producing. And then in my second part, I look at issues relating to ethics, because this is, of course, speaking to a forum which is of great concern to you at ITB, which is about the ethical implications of the huge advances in science and technology. Now, as I said, speaking in Bandung is particularly symbolic for somebody from India concerned about the politics of knowledge. And I hope through your forum and through this lecture that we can have a bigger imagination, in addition to this very important initiative of inviting scholars to speak on certain themes. I hope that the Bandung Institute of Technology in Bandung will actually be a focal point for a larger initiative on the politics of knowledge. Let's call it the non-aligned movement in knowledge, which I hope we will be able to do. So with these opening remarks, let me begin my academic argument. Can I have the next slide, please? Professor Eddie, is somebody managing the slides?
Pak Bambang? Okay. Yes,
yeah.
It's coming.
Can I have the next slide, please?
Yeah.
Next slide, please.
Slide berikutnya, Pak Bambang.
Okay. Now, I start by arguing that naming and mapping the objects in the knowledge landscape is extremely important, because the digital technology is producing many objects. And these objects at the moment have names, have particular names like Wikipedia, YouTube, Zoom, WhatsApp, TEDx, MOOC. These are particular sort of names given to those particular objects. And today, with the growth of these new technologies, there are many such objects in the audio form, in the visual form, in the multimedia form, in the written form. Now, I want to suggest to you that these objects, even though they have certain names, present us with a big question about the nature of the knowledge that they encapsulate. In fact, if you look at the debates in the academic world, there is a continuous engagement with the relationship between raw data, information and knowledge. These are three words that produce a lot of discussion, and often in between academic policymakers, there's always been this distinction that data is not information is not knowledge. But I think with the emergence of the digital world, where there is so much data being produced, and that data is now being used for producing policies, for the interventions in the market, for companies, as I will show, for companies identifying potential customers. This relationship between data, information, and knowledge has now become a very, very important relationship. I don't want to dwell on that, but I want to signal it so that you immediately keep that issue in mind. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, if the knowledge landscape, the digital landscape is so crowded, right? Why is naming those objects so important? Naming beyond the idea of just MOOCs or Google, whatever. And I want to show this by giving an illustration. You know, I don't know if you have a similar example in Indonesia, but in India, for example, the Himalayas were imagined by the British colonial authorities to be empty of people. They were considered to be empty of people, but the climate in the lower regions of the Himalayas reminded them of England. So they decided to build in the hills places that the colonial authorities could go to for holiday. From when it got very hot in the plains of India, the colonial authorities went up to the lower regions of the Himalayas, and they created the idea of a hill station. As if in an empty place in the hills, there were no people, there were no tribes, there were no communities, they were empty, and in this empty place, Little England or Little Scotland was going to be created. So the concept of a hill station created by the British disempowered a lot of local communities who were living there, because they were not empty places, they were occupied places. The hill station became a concept, changing the geography of the lower Himalayas. The same thing happened in Kenya. In Kenya, for example, the pastoralists would walk across large areas of the land. But once the British came there, they found that the highlands were wonderful to settle. So the settlers moved to the higher regions and moved the natives out, and they built their tea estates over there, creating the concept of the highlands. Now, I give this as a simple point that how naming a place begins to affect the geography of the place, because you begin to create structures of inclusion and exclusion, structures of access and denial. And the hill station and the highlands became, in a very illustrative way, a small way of maintaining inclusion and exclusion. We see this again in the politics of knowledge, politics of naming. In humanities and social sciences dominated by the West, we have the concept of the public square. And so sociologists and social scientists in India use the concept of the public square. And yet, all the way from Ukraine to India and perhaps in Indonesia as well, there's a parallel concept called the Maidan. But the Maidan is not used because the public square has replaced the Maidan as a concept. I'm giving you these very small examples to point out to the importance of the politics of naming. Now you see this in the big debate. Now move to the digital world. You see this in the big debate taking place among software people who were committed to the politics of creating the free open source software movement. And the free open source software movement realized that the word free was producing a misconception, that the software was not free, that the idea was that it should, so therefore they introduced the L, free, libre, open source software, to suggest that it was not a commercial, free did not refer to a commercial question, but free referred to a political question, that you were free to participate in the software, to change it, to share it, to distribute it without permissions. So FOSS indicates a very significant debate about the politics of naming that took place in the digital world. Now, I want to suggest to you that we now must, if you accept my argument about the politics of naming, let us look at the digital landscape and participate in this politics of naming. And the two terms that I want to introduce is that when we look at all these Google or Facebook or Linux, how are we going to name them? Are we going to look at them as objects in a commons or as objects that belong to enclosures? This is an important distinction because several players in the digital landscape, corporates, universities, professional associations, political movements, even multilateral institutions, want to name these objects, want to determine how these objects should be accessed, how these objects should be regulated, how these objects should be used, and that controversy of how to access these objects constitutes the politics of naming and the politics of knowledge commons and enclosures. Next slide, please. Now, what is driving these objects in the digital universe? In my title, I've used the concept of the crystal ball, only to suggest to you that we are living in a period when the digital universe is changing the world so fast. I think in the opening remarks, Madam Chair said that things are moving so fast that it's hazardous for me sitting in 2022 to even forecast what will happen in 2030, leave alone 25 years from now, because things are changing so fast. The very fact that we can have a seminar like this and the word a hybrid seminar has entered our language only shows the speed with which the world is being transformed. Now, the digital technologies have two faces. They empower, and you have, you just have to look at ordinary people's profile pictures and you will see how empowered they feel. If you do a symbolic or semiotic analysis of photographs in the digital world, and this is important because now it is not just the elite who post photographs, but everyone posts photographs. In fact, when I was in Indonesia, I was so impressed at the range of 4G technologies. This was 4 years ago, that even though I was taking a boat to Komodo Island, I saw young people who were selling coconuts on their mobile phones, sending messages. They were communicating. In fact, when one of the biggest mobile technology companies in India, Reliance, introduced the mobile, they came up with the slogan, Dunya Muthi Mein, which is the world is in your palm. So you do not need to have education to be able to access. The technology allows you to access. M-Pesa is a technology in Kenya where today, even if you you go to the vegetable market and you buy vegetables, you can make payment electronically. So it is true that the digital technologies have produced a huge empowering of people across the world. But the digital technologies are also controlling. I mean, the classic example is this debate in the law courts in the US of Google, who every time you type a query, directs your query to one of its own preferred websites. Or Google, as you know, has signed an agreement with Apple phones to pay them something like $10 or $12 billion for making the Google app the preferred app on Apple phones. So it's also controlling, because now these big players are beginning to use their power to dominate the owner of the phone. And we are at the threshold when 4 or 5 new technologies are all coming together. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, neuroscience, genetics, astrophysics. I mentioned these 5, there may be more, but all these technologies are producing huge amounts of data. Remember my earlier point about data, information, knowledge, are producing huge amounts of data. And that data through AI is now being processed into patterns. And those patterns are beginning to influence policy and influence government. So you see it in terms of digital medicine, you see it in terms of election manipulation. I believe there is some talk that the recent elections in the Philippines was manipulated by the company Cambridge Analytica. This is speculative at the moment, but it has been widely reported that the Marcos family went to these consultants to get them to micro-target voters with certain messages. This happened in Brazil. This happened in India. This happened in the UK, where companies that have access to vast amounts of data are able to, in fact, Cambridge Analytica in the US got 80 million addresses from Facebook and then targeted them with certain messages. So what is driving this new landscape, digital landscape, are the digital technologies. The second, of course, is the logic of capitalism. These companies are doing this not because of the social good, but because of profit. And I will say that a little later. And therefore, as these technologies develop, as new spaces open up in the digital world, those spaces have to be controlled. So you therefore create an intellectual property rights regime, and you build enclosures. An enclosure is a place that other people cannot enter unless they pay a fee to enter. The third thing that happens is the corporates therefore want to monetize their power. And you see this, the biggest companies in the world, I think as of today, the largest company has gone back to being Aramco, but Apple was the largest company, some $2.3 trillion in terms of its capitalization. Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook are the biggest companies in the world. And they have so much power that political regimes across the world, particularly in countries that have strong regimes, not India, not Indonesia, not South Africa, because our governments are still behind. This is very important, are debating how to regulate these big companies. So the European Union has only recently, as recent as a few weeks ago, passed something called the Digital Markets Act, which gives the government and the regulator the power to regulate. The US has still not passed something like this, but it is holding Congress hearings on the power of big companies, because these are unelected companies. These are companies that have the power to manipulate, using their technology, your thoughts, as I will show you a little later. So if the top 3 digital technologies, logic of capitalism, and the desire of the companies to monetize their profits is driving the digital universe in a certain way. Democracy is driving it in the other way. And I said my experience in Indonesia proved to that point, that wherever you go, people are now using the smartphone to get pictures, to capture situations which are considered to be violent, tyrannical, authoritarian, to write poetry, to produce videos, to record lectures. So democracy is opening up spaces which have so far been controlled by regimes and by elites. So both processes are taking place at the same time, and in this universe is where, I mean, what I've just done so far is indicate that it's a crowded universe, indicate that it is a universe that needs to be named. I've identified its drivers, and now I'm inviting us to make an intervention. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is where I believe these two key concepts of knowledge commons and enclosures comes in. Because when we confront these many objects in the digital universe, we need to name them. We need to say, no, this belongs to the commons. This you can keep as an enclosure. This as a commons allows certain features. So what does a commons do? What is a commons? A commons is a resource. It's a resource where you find varieties of knowledge, and it's particularly in countries like Indonesia and India, which are so diverse. Indonesia being diverse in terms of an archipelago of islands. I only saw a small glimpse, but from Bali to Flourish, I went across a vast, and of course, Jakarta, I went across a vast terrain. Now, these human communities in these various places have produced knowledge. And that knowledge, I believe, should belong to the commons. So the commons is a knowledge resource. It is also an activity. It's an activity in which people collectively produce a commons, what I call commoning. It's collaboratively being produced. And thirdly, a commons is a place. So it's a resource, it is an activity, and it is a place. It is a place which has certain rules, on the basis of which you have access to the resources. The rules regulate your access to these resources. So what are the three features of the commons? And this is true of the natural commons, which I now want to translate to the digital commons, right? These three features are there of the natural commons. They've come from the economic literature on the commons in the natural world, the physical commons, and largely in terms of literature which came out of England. The first feature is non-excludability. Nobody should be excluded from the commons. This is an important point. When as engineers you debate this new knowledge that is coming up, and you say, no, put this in the public domain. Let this be part of the creative commons, right? So non-excludability, the knowledge that is being produced, and that is why, as I said in the beginning, Bandung is so important. Maybe we can start a movement. Non-excludability. People should not be excluded from the knowledge that is being produced. Second is non-subtractability. Now, in the natural commons, subtractability means that if you enjoy some of the resources in the commons, you must make sure that you leave enough resources behind for other people to enjoy. So it is not your use of the resource does not leave less resources, subtractability, for other people to enjoy. Now, fortunately, in the knowledge commons, your use of the resource produces more resources for other people to enjoy, not less resources like in the physical commons. Like if you go to a grassland, or if you go to a river and you take water from a river, right? You consume those resources, leaving less resources for the next person to enjoy. Whereas in the knowledge commons, you are producing, because you are enjoying the resource, you are producing more resources which other people can enjoy. And thirdly, you must have a governance system where which regulates the issues of access. Now, in the digital commons, the free open source software movement has recognized this, and it has produced four very clear rules of use. You can study you can use the software, you can study it, you can copy it, you can modify it, you can redistribute it, and the whole debate is about how to utilize these rules. In contrast to the commons is the idea of the enclosure, and a lot of the knowledge that is being produced today is moving into enclosures. That means excluding people from the knowledge, whether it is scientific knowledge, whether it is economic knowledge, whether you are being excluded, and you're being excluded through IPRs, intellectual property rights. I know there are lots of arguments in terms of IPRs, and I'll give you 4 cases to tell me how you would name them. Are they commons or are they enclosures? So law is used to exclude. Financial resources are used to exclude. And technology is used to exclude. Like, if you don't have the right APIs, for example, you will not be able to talk to other programs. Now, this is not a normal process. I suppose technologists listening to me will say, but why shouldn't we have IPRs? After all, IPRs reward the creator, IPRs reward the inventor. I'm saying to you that during the early days of COVID, 3 major institutions, I've given 3 examples, 3 major institutions in the cultural field took their resources, their knowledge resources, and placed them in the commons, took them from the enclosures and placed them in the commons. The first is the Bolshoi Ballet Company in Moscow. They allowed people to enjoy online anywhere in the world at any time the great, beautiful aesthetic performance of the Bolshoi Ballet. Similarly, the National Theatre in the UK took their resources, their digital resources, which were there in their archives, which were there. Earlier, you had to pay if you wanted to access Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet or something, you had to pay each time you wanted to watch a Hamlet production. But during the early days of the COVID, they took those resources from the enclosures and placed it into the commons. And the same thing happened during the Berlin Philharmonica. They placed their musical concerts from the enclosures into the commons. The next slide, please. Now, so you have enclosures and you have commons, and it's not very clear that things which belong to the commons are naturally there, and things which belong to the enclosures are naturally there. I suggested in my earlier part of the lecture that these are political decisions, these are moral decisions, these are ethical decisions, which should belong to the commons and which should belong to the enclosures. Because if it's commons, everyone can, nobody's excluded, everyone can enjoy it, everyone can participate in it. If it's an enclosure, you have to pay, and only those who can pay can afford to enjoy it. So let's take 4 and maybe 5 illustrations of commons and enclosures. Let's take COVID-19 research. As you well know, this vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, was moved from the beginning of its research to its acceptance by the Federal Drug Agency, all within 1 year. Normally, it takes about 3, 5, 7 years. It takes many years to move from the lab to policy, to its acceptance. This took 1 year. And why did it take 1 year? That right from the beginning of the research, the world realized we were in the threshold of a pandemic. So the genetic structure of the virus was put online, was put available. That means it was made for commoning. The knowledge. In fact, China put its early research online, and labs right across the world began to share their findings online, so that lots of researchers from across the world could join the research, could participate in what I called commoning in my definition of the commons. They could participate in commoning and thereby contributing to our knowledge of the virus, and thereby contributing to the development of a technology that could respond to the virus, a vaccine. Now, once the vaccine was developed, what was a commons became an enclosure. The vaccine immediately became part of an intellectual property rights regime, Even though, please remember, in the early days of the vaccine, and you can check this out, they received huge public funds. I think Germany gave a few billion euros for research to the lab that was working on it. So they received huge public funds, right? Yet, when the vaccine was developed, it became the property of Pfizer, Moderna, right? And even when South Africa and India went to the WTO and said, look, people are dying across the world, Africa does not have access to these vaccines, make sure that the vaccine patent becomes public knowledge. It was resisted. It was resisted by all the countries of the global north. So the vaccine moved from being a commons to an enclosure. Let's take the second example. Google has just created, I mean, I'm sure you know this better than me, but they've just announced that they are creating, I mean, Google is using the concept of the commons to name one of their new initiatives called the data commons. And what are they promising in the data commons? They are going to take publicly available data like census records, health records, housing records from the United States. The project has started in the United States, and they're going to process this data, and they're going to convert it into information, and from information to knowledge, and they're going to use very sophisticated software algorithms to make that data accessible. And Google says that we are going to give us your knowledge, give us your data. So they may come to the Indonesian government and say, give us all your data, and we will make it available so that your researchers just have to type, what is the relationship between, say, age and COVID? Or what is the relationship between nutrition and COVID in Florence, in the island of Flourish? Google will have processed this data in such a way that these correlations will be easily made. Now, is Google, which is a company committed to enclosures, suddenly moving towards the commons? This is a question I ask us to think about. Because if it is moving into a commons, then the power of the commons idea that we are trying to introduce is gaining momentum. Or is Google pretending to enter the commons, but actually taking all this data, and maybe 10 years from now, 5 years from now, all that data they'll charge you to use the data, because now the data will be with Google. Sorry? Can I cut? Okay. All the data will be through Google, and unless you have access to their APIs, you will not be able to access that data. So there's a second case I want you to talk a bit, think about the commons versus the enclosures. The third is Linux. Linux, as you know, started off as an open source software. But Oracle, one of the largest computer companies, which belongs to the enclosure idea, has joined with Linux to produce new products, which are freely given away by Oracle. So is this, again, is it a commons or is it an enclosure? Linux insists, because it's part of the free libre open source software, that it must meet the four rules. You can use it, you can change it, you can modify it, you can distribute it. So what is Oracle doing in free software? Why is Oracle doing this? You see, I think about 2 days or 5 days ago, I'm sure those of you in the IT field will have read that Facebook has decided, Facebook, which is one of the leaders in language processing, has decided that they will place their privatized software into the open system, because it's a software that requires thousands of people, requires commoning to attend to the bugs. So even companies like Facebook, which are in a sense recognizing the power of the commons, recognizing the power of open source software. And the fourth example is James Webb's telescope. I wrote an article on this, which Professor Eddy would have a copy. where three space agencies, NASA, the European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, 300 universities, 14 countries collaborated to produce one of the most fascinating technological achievements that can help you go back to 250 million years from the Big Bang. In other words, through collaboration, through commoning, through sharing of technologies, you produced a technology that was able to send up a telescope to the Lagrange point, 1 million miles from Earth, place it there with 4 very sensitive instruments to look at the cosmos. So we have, on the one hand, commons becoming enclosures, and finally, commons growing as commons. So this is the exciting world in which we are located, and it's an exciting world in which a prestigious institute like the Bandung must engage with it. Don't take my framing, as sacred, but engage. Is this commons? Is this enclosures? Why commons? Why enclosures? What is valuable about a commons? What is valuable about enclosures? What does enclosures deny? What do commons allow? These are questions we need to ask. And in fact, I tried to do that, in the run-up to my talk here, after I was invited by Professor Ivan and Professor Eddie. There is you may be thinking, how come this political scientist is talking about science? I spent a lot of time looking at the MIT Technology Review, because it's a fascinating document which takes, and it's got the best editorial staff, which takes technologies from all over the world and reports on them, on whether it's space technology, whether it's material technology, whether it's genetics, whether it is AI. And you get somebody like me, I can even understand what they are reporting on. So I wrote to the management, I wrote to the president of MIT, and I said, why don't you make the MIT Technology Review part of the commons? Why are you keeping it as an enclosure? Because at the moment, if you have $80, you can get a subscription, and the total subscription available online is about 100,000. Whereas if you make it part of the commons, you will get millions of young people from all over the world who will be able to enjoy these articles. Why not just one Peter D'Souza, but people in Indonesia, people in Africa, people in Brazil, all can enjoy these articles. And they replied to me and they said, wonderful idea, but our business model does not allow us to not have subscriptions. So we are going to keep it to a subscription only, but you can get 3 free articles a month to read. So you can see that even something as valuable, it's a fantastic journal. I'm sure many of you read it. Which remains part of the enclosures and is not a commons. So maybe if we can start a BIT, a Bandung Institute of Technology Review, maybe we can think in terms of creating a commons. Next slide, please. So if this is what the digital world is like, if there are these strange entities, some of which look like commons, some of which are hybrid, some of which are pure enclosures, what is our job as knowledge producers? Some of you are members of high-powered committees of the government, where the government comes to you and asks for advice. What can we as academics do in a knowledge and digital landscape that is changing so fast, where as new technologies come up, some are given the status of a commons, some are immediately, like the COVID vaccine, immediately put into enclosures, so that if you want to use the vaccine, you have to pay for the technology. What should our job be? I think that's why I said right in the beginning, let us enter this digital world. Let us make a case for the knowledge commons. And by doing that, by naming objects as part of the commons, we can set the rules for their use, for their regulation, for their access, use, and regulation. Secondly, we by participating in this discourse, like the talk I'm giving to you, by participating in this discourse, we change the public discourse. I mean, in India, we have, for example, in our intellectual property rights law, something called compulsory licensing. So if the government feels that certain medicines are required for public health, right? Pharmaceutical companies can't say we are not going to give you the technology, right? So we have created within our laws, because of the public discourse. That is why India has the cheapest medicines in the world. Or I think among the cheapest. I don't know what it's like in Indonesia. We have created policies. We have created a whole mindset which says that pharmaceutical companies cannot charge. I mean, when I come to America from India, I carry 6 months of medicines with me because medicines here are expensive. So we have created a public health system where a lot of the knowledge is in the commons, or at least if it is in enclosures, companies cannot charge massive prices, so that public health suffers. Thirdly, the great advantage of the commons is to keep this knowledge open, and this is the question of the future. Really, as you know, I mean, someone who's sort of towards the sort of evening of my professional life, I'm just fascinated by the amount of knowledge that is out there. You know, it's beyond my discipline. I mean, a political scientist talking about the digital universe is only possible because today there are sources of knowledge in the commons that are available to me. I can access this, and keeping the commons open, enriching the commons, adding more things to the commons, protecting the commons, are moral issues, are ethical issues that we need to debate, especially in as prestigious an institute as ITB. And we need to, I'm saying this because very often, as engineers and as technologists, the technology comes to you and you don't think there's a politics behind it. You don't think the technology requires you to engage with what it means, how do you store it, how is it manipulating you. And in the next part of my talk, I'll take you to some of these, and therefore preserving the knowledge in electronic form. In fact, there's a great fear that today we can still access. Yesterday, I went to a museum and I looked at manuscripts of ancient Egypt, and it's a fascinating account on papyrus scrolls of particular gods and pharaohs and the rules that govern them. Today, all the knowledge is in electronic form, and it's continuously available to you only if you have the software. What if the software changes? These are questions that we need to ask. And that is why I've got in small letters the Bandung Technology Review, basically to suggest that maybe that's an idea that we could seed, like where the institute, the Technology Institute in Bandung, can join with other institutes in Malaysia, in Vietnam, in Korea, in India, and produce a technology review where knowledge of different forms, I mean, there must be phenomenal knowledge of tides, of oceans, of I don't know, available in our countries, becomes available, so that young minds can be hugely creative. So that was my concluding point. And now, can I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Yeah. So if the technology is changing our world so fast, and if we need to engage with that world, not as just passive recipients of technology, which is often the case in India, we haven't even begun to discuss some of these ethical issues because we are passive recipients. We are so excited by technology. For example, Facebook has just come up with a new spectacles with Ray-Ban, which the glasses function as videos. So I can just press a button, and the spectacle will begin to record for 30 seconds. So I don't need to ask your permission. I can come to you in your office, and I can record what you're saying and what you're speaking. So privacy, issues of privacy, etc. But nobody's asking these questions of technology. In fact, I've listed 5 or 6 cases where ethical issues are there. But let me begin by narrating that a year ago, I gave lectures on science and ethics at one of our prestigious engineering institutes, the Birla Institute of Technology. And the students there, very bright students, extremely competent, said, "So, why do we need to? We are engineers. We are computer engineers, electronics engineers. Why do we need to think about ethical issues? Because for us, the real challenge is to write an algorithm. These ethical issues are very simple. They don't. I mean, we can this or that. We don't need to engage with the complexity of the ethical issues. Whereas the algorithm is very tough. That we need to work on. So why are we required to attend classes on ethics in technology institutes?" And I'm saying to you, if my preceding lecture has pointed out to anything, I'm saying to you that ethics is at the heart of all technology. And unless you create within your students, unless you create within your community of faculty some engagement, some competences on these ethical issues, the technology will take you over. The technology will have impacts, like I've shown you, which you will not be able to resist. The classic case is the self-driving cars. Now, there's so much technology about self-driving cars. Elon Musk and all are, and ethicists ask the simple question: okay, you have an algorithm which is running the car. The car is driving along the road, and suddenly it sees a child. The child throws a ball across the road and starts running across to collect the ball. So the car has the algorithm tells the car you have to swerve. But if it swerves, the algorithm sees 3 elderly ladies on the side of the road. What should the car do? Kill the child or kill the three ladies? This is a complex problem in ethics. How do you decide who is more valuable? How do you decide? So therefore you'll begin to see the car will be because the program has said save children and kill old ladies. The old ladies will be killed. It doesn't say kill old ladies, but it says save children. So the algorithm already has built into it a certain ethical bias. Case number 1. Case number 2. I wrote about this, and this would, I think, disturb many people in many parts of the world. There's a new technology that is developed in the University of Maryland about 2 or 3 months ago, where a man who needed a heart transplant, he had tried everything, and none of the standard technologies were working for him. So the University of Maryland Heart Center got special permission from the Federal Drug Agency to transplant a pig's heart into this man. And the pig's heart had some 12 genetic features which were removed, and therefore so the pig itself was genetically transformed, and the heart worked, was put into this man, and it pumped. As they said, his heart became like a Ferrari car. It worked so well. He died recently because they discovered that the pig's heart developed a certain virus, and that virus killed him. But the technology of xenotransplantation has now become a big area in kidney transplants, in heart transplant. In fact, there is a farm in Germany that run by an expert in xenotransplants who wants to breed pigs for organs, so that the large backlog of organs. Now, what does this mean for people of certain religious disposition? Jews, Muslims, vegetarians, Hindus, etc., who think if this is the only heart available, what should you do? Should you encourage this research? Should you ban such research? Should you suppress such research? Ethical issues. Science has to now confront. Third example, face recognition technology. I mean, for the first time, Google engineers went on a protest saying that you are asking us to develop face recognition technology, which is you present it as benign. It will help us locate thieves or locate lost people. It will help us identify, like Aadhaar, the identity card in India. So poor people who have no literacy, who have no education, can now get an identity card because the card number has been given specifically to a person whose face has certain features. So these are huge benefits. As I said, it is empowering, but it is also controlling. And yet the same technology is used for military drones, because you have perfected the ability to, the thousands of the millions of billions of pictures that are there in Google photo archives are used to develop a technology which is used for military purposes. So Google had to actually publicly announce about 2 years ago that they would not do research for military drones. So on the one side, it is empowering. On the other side, it is hugely damaging. Take the fourth case, Google and surveillance. There is a book by a Harvard law professor, Shoshana Zuboff. If you just think about it, all of us, in fact, the word Google has entered our vocabulary. Why don't you Google it and find out? That's what we say. So just see, the whole program to Google is free to us. It's free to the whole world, to millions and billions of people. Just Google in many languages. Now you can Google in many languages, and it's free. You don't pay for the access to the software to find out. If I want to find out how many faculties are there in the Bandung Institute of Technology, I just Google, right? But so Shoshana Zuboff says Google is not interested in recovering the money it has spent to develop the software. It is interested in your data. So when Peter D'Souza types Google and says Bandung Institute of Technology, how many humanities, Google knows that Peter D'Souza is interested in humanities. So gradually a profile of Peter D'Souza will emerge in Google. So the next time I type, it will give me information on humanities, and so on and so on. And that information will then be sold to commercial companies. So if you notice, if you type, I'm sure you all know this, if you type, holidays in Bali, immediately everything connected to Bali will come up the next time you type holidays. So the data profile of the users is where the money lies. And now, and increasingly, they acquire a full understanding of the user. There's this very famous Israeli historian who says that Google can tell you if you're gay or if you're not gay by looking at how your eye moves when you see an advertisement. If you look at a man and you're a man, then you're gay. So he says they can even know you're gay before you know you're gay, because they have already developed a profile of you from your screenshots or whatever. Then COVID-19 technologies, tracking technologies, and privacy, that has been debated. But now most recently is election manipulation. These algorithms are being used. Cambridge Analytica scandal is there. You can Google it, and you will find out to point out that it is possible to target people. In the opening remarks, Professor Eddy talked in terms of intolerance, etc. Today, with these technologies, one can heighten such intolerance. One can destroy the social fabric of a society, as is happening in many parts of the world. They say Brazil elections of Bolsonaro was through the use of WhatsApp. And the recent Philippine elections, I just said, also seems to have been manipulated like that. Give me 2-3 more minutes and I'll conclude. And then the horrible story recently of apps on Apple and Google, which were used by men in West Asia. I think it was in Kuwait, who were selling their maids online. The maids had come from poor countries of Africa working for them, did not know that these people had taken photographs of them and they were selling them online. A new form of digital slavery had emerged. So you see, unless we engage with these ethical issues, the technology is going to dominate us. And to engage with ethical issues, I've shown one engagement, deciding what is a commons and what is an enclosure. But general engagement with ethical issues has to be part of the training at institutions such as yours. Princeton did a case where face recognition technology denied a young boy from going to see his sister's graduation because he had the data system had shown that he was charged in some violent case somewhere else, and therefore he was shown as an unreliable member of the audience. So the important thing is now these technologies are going lower and lower. So your security guard can deny you the right to enter a place because we have not adequately discussed the ethical implications of these technologies and not created the political and social systems to debate these. Every institute in India now has got CCTV cameras, and the argument is, it's good for security. Every housing society has CCTV cameras. If your house gets burgled, the police will come to the society office and say, show us the CCTV pictures. If you say we don't have CCTV, they will not proceed with the investigation. This happens in Delhi. So what I'm saying to you is, I don't think you can afford to be indifferent to the ethical issues of technology, because these ethical issues then translate into policy, translate into politics, translate into administration, and before you know it, you have lost control over your lives. So then how do you bring these ethical issues? Can I have the last slide, please? Next slide. How do you debate? Where do you debate these ethical issues? First of all, in academic institutes, I think you must develop an ethics curriculum, particularly in technological institutions, because the smart ones who come to do technology, and in India, I mean, getting into these leading technology institutes like IIT or BIT, Birla Institute of Technology, is very difficult, hugely competitive. Thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people compete for a few thousand spaces. So they think that they don't need to do soft subjects like ethics and humanities. They need to only do the hard subjects, computer-aided design or language programming, AI production, and that sort of stuff. So I'm saying universities need to develop an ethics curriculum. Then you need to have an ethics charter within companies. Facebook has an oversight board, Google has an ethics charter, but many companies don't. And there's a classic case of McKinsey, where it's the largest consulting firm in the world, simultaneously gave advice to the government and to the drugs company that the government was seeking to regulate. So, crossing a red line. The third area is where you can have ethics training is professional associations. The International Electrical and Electronics and Electrical Engineers have developed a code of ethics, right? And you see that similar code of ethics in the field of genetics, where there is a ban on human cloning. So the third is professional associations debating this. The fourth is state regulation. The EU has recently passed the Digital Services Act. The fifth is multilateral agencies. And the final one is, of course, where you and I are located, through public discourse, writing in newspapers and academic workshops, raising these questions of, like I did in an article on what should the government do regarding xenotransplantation? Or how do you see the James Webb Telescope? I think it's important for us as scholars, as intellectuals, to participate in these and to generate a public discourse. And a prestigious institute like Bandung Institute of Technology, I mean, it's such a privilege to speak here. I think can lead this, at least for Indonesia, if not for Southeast Asia, if not for Asia. So I thank you very much for the honor of speaking to you, and I look forward to the discussants' comments and to the Q&A. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Professor Peter de Souza for the very, very interesting presentation. And now it's time for Professor Armin Langi to comment or respond to the presentation. But before that, I'd like to share a screen about the profile of Professor Langi. So because I know that not all the participant is from ITB, so I'd like to introduce Professor Langi. Okay, so Professor Armin Langi is the Information Technology Research Group. He is one of the member of the Information Technology Research Group in School of Electrical and Engineering Informatics of ITB. He was a member of the National Research Council and also a visiting professor at the Stanford University. And he was also a rector for Maranatha Christian University in Bandung, Indonesia. And he is also a senior member of the IEEE. So this is a very short introduction for Professor Armin Langi. And our next agenda is the discussion or the response or comment from Professor Langi about the presentation, and the time is about 15 minutes. So for Professor Armin Langi, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Professor Marlia Singgi. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great honor and pleasure to respond to very important and interesting, thought-provoking thinking from Professor Peter de Souza, where promoting knowledge commons as our response to expanding digital landscapes as our future reality. Let me start with confession. Yeah? When I was young, I thought I knew everything about future. But now I realize I know nothing about the future. Talking about future in education to me is like trying to put pieces of puzzle. Although piece has its own shape, the reality emerges after pieces are put together. There are many puzzles to respond, but this morning I shall respond probably 3 or 4 of them. First, the issue of future of education related to the issue of knowledge commons. Second, about new reality. The third, about how do we understand the issue of debates about knowledge common and knowledge closure, and perhaps some ethical issue. So let me start with the first point I would like to make is try to understand the education in digital landscape. But let me start with the end of my talk, actually general response to the idea of what we are talking about. I call first quadrant knowledge. What I mean by that is Professor De Souza introduces two perspectives of knowledge. One is either it commons or enclosure, whether it is openly produced and openly accessed, or it is closely, secretly produced and privileged access. You have to have privilege to access that. That's in the x-axis, and the y-axis is whether it's public interest of the progress of public, or just interest of certain individuals, corporates. Both are okay, but the first quadrant is both commons and public. I think there are many options we can focus on, but we should focus on the first quadrant knowledge, because that's going to be open and interest of public. And now about some more details of my response is something to do with education. What do we mean by education? It's we extract knowledge out of reality and we educate that knowledge into students. So when we talk about the interaction between education and knowledge, which is the context of our discussion this morning, I cannot help but have to divide it into three phases. I said three phases: the past education, present education, and future education. Our reality today is shaped by past education, because the past education educate the engineers, technologies, and they shape the reality. And we have digital reality today. And present education address what we call student needs. We assume we know what the needs of the students, both by educational program and also through the digital culture interaction. Only then we can talk about future education. I think we can only focus on what we call how the education is shaped by this reality. That's probably three framework that I can think of how we can use it to discuss this issue. And the second thing I would like to respond to is what we call reality. New reality. And I think very nicely Professor De Souza expressed in 4 simple words how we understand reality. There are many formulations about reality, but seems to be there are layers of human reality, nicely put by Professor Souza in what we see, what we name, and how we relate, and how we regulate them. We call it, the first one is the visual reality. The second one is literal, symbolic reality. The third one is cause and effect reality. And also the final one, I'm trying to find the right word, perhaps I would say value reality. Something that you call it the central, the ethical central of anything that we develop, something of value. So when we talk about what we see, how we name it, how we relate them, and how we regulate them, we talk about the complete layers of reality: hard reality, soft reality, liquid reality, and vaporous reality. Because the value is just something that can come and go. And what is important for me is that why we need knowledge, because knowledge becomes the content of education. When we educate people, we internalize knowledge. And knowledge is basically a representation of reality that we experience, but in certain way that emphasize certain things. So when we have this enclosure knowledge or open knowledge, we have a selection of how we see the reality. And that's going to impact the engineers, graduates that shape our reality. Now, talking about reality, let me see if I can show you what Professor Sosa was talking about. I have with me now the kind of virtual reality. Let me try to enter it now and see if we can somehow together enter it, and we can see what's happening now. Let me enter it. Okay, and now I can connect to that virtual reality. Okay, now I'm entering it and I'm casting through the system. And now I'm trying to connect by sharing it. And hopefully it works. Okay, so it's still working. So I just continue with some So basically we have new reality where the education issue is being addressed. And my final issue is related to ethical issue. Is knowledge revelations or secrets? When we know something, is that something that open to society, or actually we know something, we hide them? And what is the best institution to generate knowledge? University or corporates? That's the issue that is not easily answered, but I think open to discussion this morning. My experience, for example, when we talk about codifying knowledge, we talk about two bodies of journal publications, as well as perhaps patent public registration. And right now, we have the ideas that journal publications would publish peer-reviewed journals, so papers that we consider worth publication. But more and more, as Professor Sosa said, that publication will be based on the economic business model of the journal. So it's going to be decided by editors and the publisher based on more on economical reasoning than proliferation of knowledge. So another ethical issue that I think we should consider is future of our education based on that. Originally, we educate students, but more and more, we make machines to be like smarter in the process of education. So we have digital education and also graduates, usually students, men graduates, but now user IDs graduates. Teachers used to be human teachers, but now we have also machine that teaches students. And also the objective of education used to be liberation of human mind, but now it is based on economical reasoning. So if the students have to pay tuition so expensively, he is going to or she is going to consider education as an economical benefit. So I think that's what my response more or less. Let me go back to the previous slide that I mentioned, going back to this. At the end, we have many, I divided into 4 options of knowledge that we can consider. The first quadrant, the second quadrant, the third quadrant, and the fourth quadrant. All have rights to be developed. But as public institutions, perhaps we should consider what is open and benefit to the public. Because I think the other quadrants have been taken care of very well by corresponding institutions. So I think, thank you for the opportunity to respond to this, and I'm looking forward for debates on this issue. Going back to Professor Marlia, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Armin Langi. So I would like to invite Professor Peter de Souza. Maybe you want to comment, respond to the Professor Langi's comment, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Langi. I mean, I think you've extended my presentation and you've done it with a lot of elegance. So thank you very much for those points. I like the way you converted my 4 points: see, name, relate, and regulate into visual, literal, cause, effect, and value. I think that's a very productive way of seeing these concepts of see, name, relate, and regulate. So thank you very much. I think that's quite useful. I think your final point that we need to, I mean, again, the distinctions you make between universities and corporates. I think your final point is significant, that since you are a public institution, you must focus on only some quadrants, the idea of public knowledge and the idea of knowledge commons, because enclosures and corporate knowledge is taken care of by other institutions. I want to complicate that a little bit by suggesting to you that today the role that universities played in terms of producing knowledge. So when a lot of policy makers, I don't know if there are any policy makers in the audience, but a lot of policy makers based their policies on the knowledge that came from universities, because universities work on the assumption that knowledge is open, that knowledge is testable, that knowledge is produced using certain validity protocols. That is the assumption, that the knowledge is produced using validity protocols which any other knowledge producer can check.
Yes.
However, I want to suggest that in the last 20 years, maybe 30 years, a lot of knowledge is being produced by corporates, which is particularly consultancy firms, which is going into policy making. And the universities are losing their presence as the main source of knowledge producers. So our knowledge is going into journals, but it is increasingly, if I can use a short form, increasingly Davos is influencing policy making in many countries across the world. And how they produce their knowledge, we don't know. How do they write beautiful reports about how to privatize water, about how to regulate education, about public health, etc. But who produces that knowledge? How does it come? Is it peer reviewed? All these protocols are missing. So the point I want to make is increasingly there is a new class of knowledge producers that do not submit to the same protocols that universities submit to, the validity protocols, and they are becoming more influential than universities. There is, of course, there is a counter resistance to this, increasingly universities, and I think, I don't know if it's there in Indonesia, keep aside a certain budget for ensuring that research in the universities enters the commons, the Creative Commons. So I can publish an article in, say, a Cambridge journal, which earlier was part of the enclosure. Only if I had membership of the journal could I get that article.
Yeah.
Now, if I pay Cambridge Journal, say X £1,000, X number of £1,000, Cambridge will put my article in the Creative Commons for the whole world to access, because they've already recovered the commercial cost to that. So there are many universities in the West who are saying that, no, we want our research to go into the public domain. That is the condition of the project. So we will pay the journal to put it in the Creative Commons rather than only subscribers. So these are all issues that come up which we need to think about. So I found that very interesting. I would have loved to see your virtual reality display.
Very soon.
I think that was fascinating. So thank you very much for your comments. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much for Professor Lange and Professor De Souza. And now we have time for Q&A session from the floor. So it will extend the discussion. So maybe I'd like to, we will divide this about 30 minutes discussion. So we will divide it into 2 parts, 15 minutes each. So I would like to invite the floor to ask the question, and you can give your comment or your question in the chat column, or you can raise hand. You can use the raise hand icon at the bottom, okay, and for direct communication. So I would like to invite maybe 2 or 3 participants to raise the question, please.
Ibu Marlia?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
just straightforward, because nobody responded or raising hand.
I think that you are very, I'm very honored to have you, Pak Harun. Okay, yes, please. Okay. We have also one in chat, but Professor Harun first. Okay, please.
All right. Interesting. It's a very interesting talk and provoking thought, that related to ethics and technology. Come into my mind just abruptly is regarding the level of democracy that each country or every country's got, which is quite maybe different, right? Totally different. So I don't know how you relate to this, because, when we come to ethics and debate, normally there are a lot of parties, if you like. We are from academic, of course. I think we're quite in between, right? In between to look at the very middle way. But, the other sides, politicians, and then media, they in digital era rather uncontrollable. What would be the effective way to keep the ethics works well? Whether we should elaborate more ethics in academic environment, or how effectively we can influence the decision maker in that way. So that's whether any trade-off of having a good deal for us as academician or
Okay, thank you, Pak Harun. I think that the question will be directly answered by by Professor De Souza, please.
Again, thank you very much for that question. There were bits of it that were not very clear, but I read your question on the chat group, and I think it's very important for us to recognize that these new digital technologies are beginning to impact our politics, are beginning to impact our social fabric. For example, in India, digital technologies, WhatsApp, is leading to a lot of communal conflict between the major communities in India, because hate, the politics of othering, has now become such an important part of democratic politics. Not favorable, but factual. Now, your question is, how do we regulate this? I think one direction of regulation is to place a responsibility on the platform, whether it is Twitter or Facebook or direction in which the direction in which it is going is to begin to place responsibilities on the platform. As I said, the European Union has already passed a Digital Services Act, which places responsibilities on the platform. The United States has still not yet developed this. In many countries, they've now passed laws but these are not applied. So in addition to the regulation through law, my strong defense is to strengthen a public discourse, because when people begin to question what is happening in these technologies, the makers of these technologies will worry about reputation risk, will worry about their companies. As I said, Google and Facebook have had to face a lot of criticism. Even Microsoft had to face a lot of criticism, because the beauty of the technology community, there's always resistance, there's always criticism. That is why Linux came up, because they felt that the operating systems of MS-DOS were too controlling. So my short answer to you is that if we educate, if we do those 6 things that I've listed in my last slide: universities, professional groups, state regulation, international professional associations, international organizations, and public discourse, I think we will have created a sufficient debate to ensure that both the corporates, the platforms, and the regulators check the excesses. But there's no guarantee. I mean, fake news is such a serious problem. Not just fake news, but deep fakes. The technology has produced deep fake, which is such a problem. So I can only say, let's debate it, because I don't know which direction it is going. And I think Professor Langi rightly said, we don't even know what education will look like in 10 years from now, leave alone 20 years, because it's changing so fast. So unless we create a public debate, we will not know how to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor De Souza and Professor Harun. And this is a question from the chat. Allow me to read it from Mr. Wikan. And what do you think about the spreading of disinformation via social media nowadays? Whether it can disrupt the society or not? What is your prediction then? Professor De Souza, please.
No, I think this is a very serious problem, the spreading of disinformation through social media. And I don't know how to regulate it. I mean, recently, you must all be reading about the whole debate on Twitter. Elon Musk has bought Twitter. and he says that he's going to make it what he calls the, he begins by saying he's a free speech absolutist, and he's going to make Twitter into a global town hall. I think many liberal scholars are worried that it will become a platform for a lot of hate speech, and he's going to unblock the ex-president Donald Trump. So social media is producing a lot of destruction of the fabric of society. In India, we see this all the time. We don't even know what you see. People pass off fake news as real news because it's so professionally done. The political parties have professional media organizations to intervene. I mean, the largest political party in India, the BJP, the current party in power, has said that within minutes, they can activate 50,000 WhatsApp groups across the country, so that one message goes all over the world. So I don't know. I mean, democracy has to debate this, because on the one side is free speech, on the other side is control and technology and damage. So yes, I agree with the question. It is something that we must worry about.
All right. Okay. So yeah, because sometimes we cannot differentiate between hoax or the real news. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. This is also an appreciation from Dinda Lisna. Thank you for having Professor Peter. Yeah. And there is a question also from Pak Togar, Professor Togar Simatupang. This is a quite long question, but I'd like to read it carefully. Okay, many thanks for excellent presentation. This presentation on colonization of digital landscape poses a dilemma for university. One side relates to the goal of education itself, which goes in hybrid direction, whether there is a task, mission, or responsibility for the colonization of the digital landscape. On the other hand, the issue of capitalism in the form of returns for university and funding. What do you think about this, Professor De Souza, to solve the dilemma, and what is the advice for ITB?
Again, thank you for the question, because that is exactly the dilemma that I'm struggling with. But in this dilemma, as somebody who works on education, and particularly in countries like ours, Indonesia and India, I'm all for public universities. So I agree with Professor Langi that we must focus on the public and we must focus on knowledge production. So my first response to the question is that we must encourage the state to produce high quality public universities, and we must encourage the administrations of these universities to ensure that this quality is maintained. We already have that in our Indian technology institutes. So they are public universities. Universities their education is highly subsidized. There is no profit making, and yet they produce engineers and technologists and managers who are of global quality. I mean, they run Microsoft, they run Google, they run IBM, they are the chief executive officers of these top technology companies. And it has all come through public education. Now, what does that mean for the second part of your question about capital wanting us to be? You see, again, I have to only go to these two illustrations to explore the paradox. Illustration number one is Oracle joining with Linux to produce free software that they're giving away. Why are they doing this? Why is Oracle, a capitalist entity, interested in maximizing its profit, quoted on the stock market? I mean, the head of Oracle made $1 billion profit with his investments in Tesla. 1 billion, of which he's giving some 100 million or something to. He made 7 billion, of which he's giving 1 billion to Elon Musk for his purchase of Twitter. So why is he teaming up with Linux, which is committed to open source software? It would be nice to investigate this question, because I think the answer to your question lies in Oracle joining with Linux, producing software called Oracle Linux or Linux Oracle. Secondly, why is Facebook or Meta now placing its proprietary language codes in the public domain? That means making them into the commons. Again, the answer to your question lies there, that there is something about the commons which is so valuable that even private corporates like Facebook and Oracle feel the need to utilize the resources of the commons for their corporate growth. So we are the digital world has produced these hybrid forms that we need to investigate. It's no longer only capitalism or only commons. Hybrid forms are emerging and we need to think about them. I can't give you a more definite answer. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Togar, probably I can see you here. Professor Togar, maybe you want to respond for this comment, please.
Thank you, Ibu Marlia, and then appreciation for Professor De Souza for the interesting and provoking presentation, and thank you as well for the response that you gave about this dilemma, because it happened right now in Indonesia, that whether we go or whether we serve this digital landscape. But again, your response that many things that need to be observed as well as to study, but the main message is we need to participate in this digital landscape. And one more, one more thing is about what is your advice for ITB, at least that we can influence, quote and unquote, this digital landscape, especially for Indonesia, that we have a diversity and we have a very large population and also low economy people living in this region. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for that very important question, because my knowledge of Indonesia is very limited, but my affection for Indonesia is very large. And this, I'm saying this not, I mean, this is not a polite statement. This is a statement that comes from the privilege I had of traveling around Indonesia because of Pak Iwan. He made it a point to arrange for my lectures in different parts of the country. So I see that you have problems similar to ours. The response to that problem, firstly, is to strengthen the public university. I'm saying this very important because in my country, the public universities are being weakened. India has developed its knowledge power because of public universities. So that's the first thing. The public universities can afford to spend time in developing competences which have no immediate market value. You can afford to train people in ethics and humanities and history in an engineering university because you think that produces better engineers. That an engineer who knows the history of Indonesia, the colonial history of Indonesia, would be a better engineer. But private universities would not do that. They would only go in for skill creation. It's always skilling, whereas you are more interested in producing the complete person, the citizen of Indonesia, right? So my first thing is defend public universities. Secondly, because you are such an important institution, not just in Indonesia, but in the whole region, I think it would be wonderful if ITB can lead an initiative. It may not work, like the MIT Technology Review. I mean, there are people in remote regions of your country and my country who are bright. I give the example of, I don't know if there are any mathematicians in the hall, but Ramanujan, the mathematician who was working as a clerk in Tamil Nadu in southern India, wrote some formulae, wrote some theorems, and these theorems reached G.H. Hardy in Cambridge. Okay, G.H. Hardy found that these are fascinating and went to South India and got a scholarship for Ramanujan to study in Cambridge. So Ramanujan went to Cambridge, and today those who are working in his area of mathematics still find his theorems, some of the most important theorems in the field. Now, I may be misrepresenting the case, but the case is real. So my point to you is, why can't the Bandung Institute of Technology behave like Professor G.H. Hardy? Why don't you have open days on science? Now with digital technologies, it may be possible to fire the imagination of somebody sitting in Labuan Bajo, but say today there's a very fascinating lecture on oceans or whatever, on dinosaurs, on Komodo dragon. So I think if the knowledge resources in institutes like BIT and other universities in Malaysia, in Vietnam, and I don't know, in ASEAN, let's say in ASEAN, come together to create a knowledge commons. Suppose Bandung commits itself to create a knowledge commons with the ASEAN institutions. Who knows? I mean, this may be the basis of a new knowledge renaissance. I'm only saying this because I'm very concerned about the colonization of knowledge. I mean, I see a lot of us borrowing terms, concepts, frameworks, perspectives that come from institutions in the North. And implicit in these frameworks is an ethical bias, And then we just become applicators. We don't become creators. We only become applicators. And this is an important distinction. We are no longer creators and only applicators of somebody else's creation. So that's my response to a very important question. I took a bit long in responding because you asked a question which is very dear to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor De Souza. Okay, because we have a limitation of time, we have here in the chat last question from Baharyanto. Is from Parahyangan University. Oh, this is from our neighbors. Yeah, how does the practice and the dominance of liberal epistemology in digital culture committed to shape and regulate the education knowledge of the future? So that's the question. I hope you're okay with the question.
I might talk also about this, Bu Maria.
Oh yeah, okay. Professor Langi, you want to respond for this?
Let me show you an example. I got this virtual reality running. So when we talk about digital reality, it's very strong. As you can see, we can enter a different world, and we can also perform many educational activities in this platform, and we can basically make ordinary people empowered. What we mean by that, because we can provide many tools for people to work. For example, I can join this talk this morning through virtual reality. But the point is, what do we mean by educating people now? Because we seem to be educating computers. We educate machine, algorithm to work for us. And the more we think about it, the artificial intelligence make machines smarter, and people being organize or have certain perspective, liberal perspective, based on the perspective of the corporate that develop this reality. So I'm coming back, but my point is this digital landscape is very powerful, and it's a platform that creates alternative to natural reality, and also it may bring disadvantage to countries like us with natural resources but has no technology. So I agree that we need to develop this digital landscape openly and also using our own philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Langi. You want to add some more comment, Professor De Souza?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think that's an important question, but I think I see a tension developing between a liberal epistemology and a market society. The liberal epistemology promotes openness. The liberal epistemology promotes critical questioning. The liberal epistemology challenges relationships of power. The market society does the opposite. The market society consolidates relationships of power. The market society defends enclosures. The market society talks in terms of super profits and not public good. So a tension is emerging. And I think countries like Indonesia, and I see this very seriously. That is why I began by saying maybe we can have a new NAM, non-aligned movement of knowledge. I think, please don't see me as some old-fashioned radical putting forward ideas which disturb the status quo. I genuinely believe, and I agree with Professor Langi, that we are at an important threshold because these technologies have become available to us. The challenge is for us to develop the imagination to use these. Please listen. The challenges are for us to use these technologies to empower, not to enslave. These technologies can also enslave. They can manipulate you. They can distort reality. They can play to the interests of the dominant. The challenge before educationists like us who are committed to a humanist future is to ensure that these debates remain open. That we need to develop an imagination of the global South that produces these technologies that empower and doesn't just replicate relationships of technologies as you will find in the global North. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor De Souza. For the participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very sorry that the time is very limited for our discussion. But then we come to the summary for these lectures. So I would like to invite Professor Iwan Pranoto, the Secretary of the Commission on Ethical Values of FGB ITB, to read the summary. Professor Iwan Pranoto, please. Hello, Professor Iwan Pranoto.
To summarize the wide issues that we are talking about, but I tried. Well, first, digital technologies have made the skyrocketing growth of knowledge production. That we know already. On the one hand, the situation forces us to question who owns the knowledge, produce, and who can use the knowledge. On the other hand, the fast utilization of technologies birth problems requiring new ethical considerations and studies. The digital universe is a new sphere that is like a no man's land today. It is similar to the colonial era when the Europeans discovered lands to be conquered. In this newly discovered world, all people worldwide should be involved in the naming and attaching plural stories to each invented idea. We should involve in this global discourse. Otherwise, the newly discovered world will be a foreign land to many people. At the same time, the newly discovered knowledge is on a cross path now, to commons or enclosures. How should we approach the new knowledge that will benefit most people? How should technological knowledge empower the people, but at the same time, we must ensure the knowledge does not control the people. At this critical time, we cannot be indifferent. Indifferent is impossible. We must side with the people and this fragile planet. The time is now. To realize this effort, we all must participate in defending public education institution in developing countries. Why don't we need to renounce the non-alignment on knowledge commons? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Iwan Pranoto. And ladies and gentlemen, now we have a closing remarks from Professor Yasraf Piliang, is a head of commission on the ethical and academic values of FGB ITB. Professor Yasraf Piliang, the time is yours.
Thank you for Prof. Marlia. Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, this morning we had a valuable opportunity to learn from Professor De Souza lecture titled Knowledge Commons and Digital Future, organized by the Commission of Ethical Values, Professor Forum, Bandung Institute of Technology on 30th of May 2022. This lecture is the first of 5 consecutive distinguished lectures organized by the Commission of Ethical Values, Professors Forum ITB, on the future of education and the ethical challenges. Participants of this lecture included members of professors from ITB, members of professors from Forum from other universities, academicians, and students from various universities in Indonesia. This distinguished lecture raises fundamental questions concerning the ownership of knowledge, which are particularly important in the dawn of a knowledge-based global economy and new digital landscape. How should we treat knowledge as commons or public goods, or enclosure or private goods? On the one hand, since the production and dissemination of knowledge, particularly in Indonesia, is a mandate entrusted by the government to public university using tax money, the people as the taxpayers should obtain the most benefits from the knowledge. On the other hand, because of particular political economic interests of various groups or corporates, the developed knowledge is enclosed with limited access to the general public. Regarding these ethical issues on knowledge ownership, higher education institutions, particularly ITB, have a vital role in conducting a series of public ethical discourses and scientifically contribute to generate a set of concepts related to solving these ethical problems. This concept is highly crucial because it would substantially shape the future social life and determine public trust in the university. Higher education institution will depend highly on their capability to preserve this public trust. Hence, universities have a big task in assisting the government and society in developing public policies on knowledge ownership, ensuring that the first and foremost benefit to the people. To perform this duty, the Commission of Ethical Values, Professor Verum, Bandung Institute of Technology, in this memorable moment, proposed the preparation of a declaration, the Bandung Initiative on Knowledge Commons in Science and Technology. The Bandung Initiative on Knowledge Commons in Science and Technology is derived from the primary outcome of this lecture, which broadly reflects the thoughts of the participants. The main task related to this declaration in the next couple of days is to define detailed objectives, activities, mechanism, and operationalization. We hope that the Bandung Initiative has a significant and central role in an attempt to create future built on the knowledge commons, in particular involving people from the global south. Bandung Technology Review, as it was suggested by Prof. De Souza, would be an integral part of this initiative. We are grateful for valuable minds shared by all the participants today, and we hope we could trigger the public discourses on knowledge common in our circle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yasraf Piliang. Hope that Bandung Initiative will coming soon. Okay, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the end of the program. But before we close it, our chairman of Professor Forum, Professor Edi Tribaskoro, will give something to Professor Peter de Souza as appreciation of his contribution today. So Professor Edi Baskoro, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Maria Singgi. Okay, so let us thanks again to Professor Peter de Souza for his profound and inspiring lecture, and also to Professor Armen Langi to his response. On behalf of the Forum of the Professor of ITB, Forum Guru Besar ITB, we would like to present some certificates of the distinguished lectures to Professor Peter de Souza and also to Professor Armen Langi. Please let me share the certificate. Okay. So this is the certificate for Professor Peter de Souza. Again, thank you very much, Professor Peter de Souza.
Thank you.
And also, this is a token of appreciation from us. So this is drawn by our students, actually, but with the help of the computer. And then I would like to present the certificate to Professor Armen Langi for his valuable response. Thanks, Pak Armen.
Thank you.
And this is your picture.
Oh, nice.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will send this certificate and also the token of appreciation to both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Professor Edi Tribaskoro. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, this is the end of the program. We apologize for all the mistakes that maybe we have made during the session, and thank you for the committee who arranged the program. And we do hope that this event and these lectures will give benefit for all of us. And we will see you again in the next distinguished lecture. Thank you again for Professor Peter Roland de Souza, and hope you will visit again Indonesia, not in online but offline. Yeah, come to Indonesia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And
Thank
for
you,
everybody.
Professor de Souza.
Okay, thank you
Professor
for
Arme.
all the participants.
And to
thank
all
you.
participants.
Okay, thank you for all the participants. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Terima kasih semua.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good day.
Ya, thank you Pak Edi.
Thank you Pak Togar. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank
Bapak
you
Ibu,
for
terima
all.
kasih banyak atas kehadirannya.
And the great minds.
Terima kasih Pak Edi.
Sama-sama Pak.
Terima kasih Bu Alia. Pak Langi.
Pak Waris, thank you.
Pak Arul,
Terima kasih, Thank you.
Pak Joko Suwarto,
Pak.
terima kasih. Pak Kusbiantoro.
Selamat Pak Edi.